Okay, we left off in the last video talking about this process of childbirth and the stages of childbirth. The chia is a secretions basically from the healing endometrium. Generally you will see bleeding for a couple of weeks, in controlled bleeding in mom after the delivery, as again this is a trauma to the endometrium, and the whole uterus has to shrink back down. So as it's changing, you will have secretions. They can last up to 6 weeks, but generally expect at least 2 weeks post birth. So adjustments to the baby now, or what we call a neonate. So this is now the postnatal period. This is a very stressful thing. When you birth, it's stressful. All of a sudden it's cold, it's bright, it's loud. I mean, all these things that you just didn't have to deal with when you were in the uterus. Okay, so this is a crisis. The first thing to note, and this neonatal period will last for the first 30 days, is you got to breathe. All right. So you haven't had to breathe on your own. You have to inflate your lungs, inflate all those alveoli, and you had a constriction of the blood flow and interruption of that during the birthing process. So carbon dioxide has been building up. So yes, you have respiratory acidosis, and this stimulates your respiratory center to breathe. As you inhale, you'll decrease pressure and resistance in the lungs as they become inflated, and this will allow for the closure of the foramen ovale pretty quickly. Right? Amniotic fluid has to drain out of the lungs, or is absorbed, and this is pretty efficient in most babies, or neonates. So the circulation adjustment shown here again, you're going to have to get rid of these ductus venosus, the ductus arteriosus, and the foramen ovale. So the umbilicus collapses because you've cut it and there's no more blood flowing through it, and it atrophies to become ligaments that you'd still see in yourself today. All right, the ductus venosus becomes what we call the ligamentum venosum. All right, and it just kind of shrivels up here, and you can still see remnants of this in adults. Your first breath will decrease pressure on the right side of the heart, which means the foramen ovale closes as blood starts to move back and shuts the flap here. The ductus arteriosus will constrict with oxygen changes in the aorta. So as oxygen is going to build up in here and decrease here, this will actually constrict, and we'll start to direct blood from the right side to the lungs, and then blood from the left side to the rest of the body. Now, if these fail, you have a congenital birth defect, and they can be very, very serious. So you have to regulate your temperature, you have to start digesting your own food, and you have to get rid of your own urine now. Through your kidneys and your bladder. So maintaining body heat is a problem. You have a very high surface area to volume ratio. And so you haven't really had to generate heat, so you're going to start learning how to get your muscles contracting to produce heat, and it's easy to lose that heat because of this, again, high surface area to volume ratio. You don't shriver or control the vasoconstriction easily. You don't have much adipose. You do have, instead of white fat, you have brown fat, which is used, it's a form of fat used by hibernating mammals, which can be broken down to produce heat, which is also a problem, during the stages of hibernation. So it's not as efficient at making ATP because you're devoting more of the energy to heat than you are to ATP. But that's what you need right now. All right. The fetal intestine is sterile, right? It hasn't been processing anything. You will find meconium in there, and that's because of the breakdown of blood cells that have occurred during the fetal stage. But otherwise, there are no bacteria inhabiting the neonate. So this has to be colonized right away. This happens through the birth process, sorry, and eating in the neonate, not the neonate. Sorry about that misspelling. All right, so the birth process, either vaginally or cesarean, there is a difference in what colonizes. So we do recommend vaginal births if at all possible. All right, and then, like I said, and then feeding, being very careful, introducing foods to make sure that the colonization of the intestines is appropriate, because that's going to affect the rest of the life of that child. The kidneys will work, but they're not very efficient, so you end up peeing a lot, right? And you're already mostly water, right, as we talked about back in the fluid balance chapter. So you've got to keep your neonate well hydrated and covered up, okay? Hydration is basically going to come through milk, right? So the process called lactation is when milk is produced and secreted. And this is a cooperation between two hormones, one made by the anterior pituitary and one by the posterior pituitary, as I show you here. And they're clearly affected by the hypothalamus. So it turns out that milk production, while prolactin was available during the pregnancy, it was not, the milk is actually not released, okay? So you get these alveolar glands in the mammary glands, we talked about this in the chapter on reproduction, that are modified sweat glands, right? And they expand due to progesterone, estrogen, growth hormone, cortisol, and prolactin. So they're getting bigger during the pregnancy, but they're not releasing milk, all right? So you won't lactate. You can produce colostrum, but you won't lactate during pregnancy. The stimulus for lactation will actually be the sucking of the infant, as there's stretch receptors around the nipple, and as they pull on this is perceived by the posterior pituitary, resulting in oxytocin release, and this oxytocin will actually squeeze the myoepithelial cells around the glands. Milk provides passive immunity, right? Immunoglobulin A, so the secretory IgA antibodies. It's ideal nutrition. It has the right amount of fat and protein and carbohydrates. And this process of oxytocin release will also help shrink the uterus. And mom's metabolism will increase while she's breastfeeding, right? And so this cartoon is showing this idea of how we process this. So again, prolactin is going to allow for the production of milk by these glands, and oxytocin is going to allow secretion or release. All right, so again, prolactin production, oxytocin secretion. So I say here, as I mentioned already, while prolactin increases through the pregnancy, progesterone, estrogen, and other hormones will inhibit the synthesis of breast milk. So you're not doing production. I mean, so you're ready, but you're not going to actually do the production and release of milk during the pregnancy. I say this changes once the placenta is gone. So once the placenta is gone, right, these progesterone levels and estrogen levels are going to drop rapidly, and they had been inhibiting, right, the breast milk. So as they drop, you will start the prolactins already high, so it's going to then drive breast milk synthesis or production. The stretching of the nipple triggers oxytocin, and oxytocin then, all right, causes the secretion of the milk. And so the more the child suckles, the more pulling on the nipple, the more oxytocin release, the more milk secreted, right? So generally mom can keep up with baby's demands. All right, composition, just to show this again, as we always say, please don't give your child cow's milk. I mean, that is just outright wrong, right? You didn't have a calf, you had a human child. So cow's milk is really not to be given until after the first year. And this is looking at the comparison of colostrum and milk. Colostrum comes in, and usually it can even be available at the before delivery, but is there and ready within the first right away, and will be there for about 48 to maybe 72 to 2 to 3 days. It is considered transitional milk, and then you have this mature milk that forms. Okay, so your true breast milk is coming in about between 2 and 3 days after your after delivery. Breast milk does have a laxative effect, and this helps again with the clearing of this waste product, meconium, and waste bilirubin that came from the breaking of the blood cells by the neonate. Okay, but this again shows that human milk is actually lower in protein and higher in fat, very good for development, especially development of the brain. Lots of carbohydrates for energy, just enough calcium and phosphorus and sodium so that we don't overwhelm the developing urinary and other systems. All right. So now we want to think about this in the context of what caused all this to happen, right? So all of this process that we call development and your continued development and growth and change throughout your life is really due to your genetic information. All right? So we want to, in the last part of this chapter, talk about, what is inheritance and what are our genetics, all right? So there's just a couple things I really emphasize to students here. I said, first of all, again, you have 46 chromosomes. We went back and said 23 came from the sperm and 23 came from the oocyte. And when you have 46 chromosomes, on those 46 chromosomes would be somewhere in the order of 33.2 billion nucleotide pairs. All right? So double-stranded, that means 6.4 actual billion nucleotides. All right? So, because DNA, again, is a double-stranded structure. So, two strands of 3.2 billion. So it's a lot of information. In fact, if we took the DNA out of your cells, specifically your nucleus, it's about 2 meters in length. It's a very long molecule. All right. Transfer of this information happens with meiosis and fertilization, right? So you pass on, right, in that sperm and those eggs, some of the information that made you what you are, right? So sperm gets to bring half, and egg or oocyte brings half. And when they fuse, we of course have the zygote we mentioned already with 46 chromosomes. Now, the important part about the nucleotides that we're going to focus on, I mean, it's not the only important part, but are what we call the genes. So genes are a piece or segment of this genome, all of this information, all this chemical information. And so when we look at the human genome, we have estimated that there are about 20,500, right, genes which, right, tell the cell how to build a certain protein, right? So we say protein encoding genes, right? So your patterns of inheritance, which we're trying to see how you got the traits you have and how this information was passed. We're not going to go back through meiosis or anything like that and talk about, the individual, formation of these 23 chromosomes. We want to say, now that you've passed on this material, how do we recognize what's happening here? How are these genes interacting? These genes from mom and dad, two separate individuals, all right? So I say here, just for definitions, genetics is a power of prediction, right? We want to know, right, when we talk about the field of genetics, we really are guessing, and scientifically guessing, right, hypothesizing, right, what the possibilities are of certain traits. And we want you to understand right away that your traits are your proteins. And so what is the possibility of a certain protein or trait appearing in the offspring of two separate individuals, right? Offspring from two separate individuals. So the field of genetics describes the patterns in which these genes are transmitted in families, all right? So what happens when you put back together this information, and how does that influence the proteins? And the proteins, of course, are what drive all of this development we've been talking about. I say these patterns are dependent on meiosis and combinations after fertilization, as well as how you live your life and where you live your life. So it's pretty complicated at the end of the day, which is why, we're just going to give you some very simple genetics and describe this for you on probably the next video. So we'll leave it there, and we'll talk more about this in the next video.